classic throwbacks I played in 2010, them being Mega Man 10, Rocket Knight, and Splatterhouse, Splatterhouse is the one I enjoyed the most. You hear that, Splatterhouse fans? It was worth waiting almost 20 friggin' years. Not to mention, you're gonna have trouble counting all the references to the original games. That's awesome! And yes, internets, the Happy Nerd likes and recommends Splatterhouse to all action fans, gorehounds, and metalheads. But wait, Happy Nerd, have you heard the critics? You want to talk about brutal? They hated Splatterhouse. I know, I've read those reviews too, and I actually tend to agree with them. Splatterhouse is far from a perfect game. It definitely has its flaws. Audio glitches, long load times, animation issues, those frustrating 2D segments, poorly explained gameplay mechanics, there's definitely problems here, but all this shit, it doesn't matter because the action is brutal and satisfying. The story is everything it needed to be and a hell of a lot more. The aesthetic is, let's just say, messy. The voice work is phenomenal. The licensed soundtrack is perfectly complimentary, and it features the original 3 games, including the completely uncensored arcade version. This alone is worth the price of admission if you ask me. Splatterhouse is an uneven game that gets more things right than it doesn't. Its technical faults are there and at times do bring the game down, but my mainstream counterparts are much more critical of such faults than I am. To put it simply, that shit didn't bother me. Not an awful game. But if you're not a gorehound, metalhead, or a Splatterhouse fan, you'll probably see Splatterhouse for what it is, a solid action game with a couple problems. But if you are a horror fan, gorehound, metalhead, or a Splatterhouse fan, then it's time you grabbed the 2x4 and did some fucking carpentry. Let's face facts here. Splatterhouse ain't no Bayonetta, God of War, or I guess even Dead Space 2. But neither was the original Splatterhouse, River City Ransom, Streets of Rage 2, or Ninja Warriors. Splatterhouse has always been style over substance, but one of the few great successful examples of such. Take the original Splatterhouse. It's about as basic as it gets, but it's an excellent action game. It exceeds mainly because of how successful it looks, sounds, and feels, and that's always been the strength of Splatterhouse from the beginning. Namco successfully sells the idea of the mask, the house, Dr. West, and of course the plight of our hero Rick, so much so that I'm not really bothered by how simple this game is. A lot of games back then, or even now, think that having excessive violence, blood, or even sex excuses them from making a good game. Ever played one of those terrible Doom or Mortal Kombat ripoffs from the 90s? Do you ever play one of those terrible GTA ripoffs from the aughts? How many busty heroines popped up after the first Tomb Raider became a hit? And how many horrible games just happen to have excessive swearing? These are all poor examples of style over substance. Splatterhouse is an excellent example of style over substance. Does that excuse the game from being overly simple? No. But unlike my mainstream counterparts, I'm able to overlook some of these shortcomings and enjoy these games. Part 3 not so much. Another point I'm trying to make here is the critics have never liked Splatterhouse. So I wasn't at all surprised when this new one was destroyed by the critics, and nor was I surprised to find myself enjoying it, despite its technical problems. Now this Splatterhouse was a genuine attempt to bring the series to that perfect marriage of style and substance. Unfortunately, it doesn't quite achieve this. Like I said, I pretty much agree with the critics, just think they judged way too harshly. I mean, hey, I may be the happy nerd, but even my big brother will occasionally point out the good parts to a bad game. So, let's talk about why Splatterhouse rocks, before we talk about why it doesn't. If you've seen my classic Splatterhouse reviews, you know that my biggest beef was with the story. I loved the setup, but hated the follow-through. It had such potential, especially with that huge twist on the 5th level. Maybe they were listening, cause I asked for more story, and holy shit did I get more story. But the best thing about the story is it starts right away. I love a game that doesn't waste time. Boot up a new game and immediately we meet our hero Rick, damn near drowning in a pool of his own blood. Fans will recognize the terror mask and some of its dialogue as Rick puts it on and becomes the hulking beast we all know and love. This is the first time we get a really good look at human Rick. The only times we'd seen him sans mask were in the endings of Part 2 and the worst ending of Part 3, and you couldn't really make him out. So it's great to see what he finally looks like. Wait a minute. No, they didn't. Nah, that's fucking ridiculous. They wouldn't do that. This is the first example of how much the story has been fleshed out. As the game presses on, we get answers for just about everything. Where the mask came from, how Rick found the mask, or maybe how the mask found Rick. No spoilers here. who Dr. West is, why Rick and Jennifer came to Dr. West's mansion, even details about Rick and Jennifer's relationship. Some things have been changed from the original story, but there was so little there to begin with, I didn't mind.
The story has even been expanded to include something about the eclipse bringing forth the apocalypse brought by this race of demons called the Corrupted, who Dr. West has been working for centuries because he's immortal. And you keep going through these portals that take you to the past, or sometimes the future. I don't know, I've played through this game 2.5 times and I still haven't pieced it all together. It's a complex story, and it may seem like I'm complaining here, but I'm not, because the game never loses sight of the most important thing. Dude, save your girl.
All this stuff about the Corrupted and the Eclipse is actually more important to the Mask, not Rick. The Mask and Rick develop a great symbiotic relationship that not only makes sense from a motivational perspective, but keeps the game from becoming more than what it needs to be. Rick needs the Mask so he can save Jennifer, but the Mask needs Rick so he can stop Dr. West. If I wanted to, I could piece together all the bits about Dr. West and the Corrupted. I mean, it's all there, but I really didn't care. But I also wasn't bothered, because saving Jennifer was more or less always center stage. That was always the heart of Splatterhouse for me, and it's one thing they definitely got right here. When I was reading previews for this game, I was worried the focus would be on stopping the apocalypse, but thankfully, it's about saving your girl, not the world. Though you do save the world in the end. The strength of the story is carried by its pacing and voice acting. There's a lot of story here, but cutscenes usually involve flashbacks when Rick and Jennifer enter the mansion or to bridge levels together. The majority of the story is carried by conversations between Rick and the Mask, heard usually in the downtime between fights. It's in these exchanges we learn about the Corrupted, Dr. West, and minutiae about Rick and Jennifer's relationship. Other tidbits are found in unlockable entries in Dr. West's journal, record players scattered around, and the photographs you piece together through each level.
I swear to God, you put this on the internet and your ass is grass, Buster.
So the majority of the story is delivered through spoken dialogue, and Jim Cummings is absolutely perfect as the Terror Mask, acting as this game's Cortana. Seriously, did anybody else notice that after the first Halo, every action game needs to have a disembodied narrator? Anyway, take a quick glance at Cummings' IMDb page, and you'll see he's one of the greats. If you grew up in America, it's pretty much a certainty you've heard his voice in something, whether or not you realized it. He gives the Mask a great personality that both offers guidance and abuse to Rick.
I can smell West. No mistaking that tang of insanity. Oh, and that pretty girl of yours, I can smell her too. Oh, she smells good.
The Mask's dialogue does get pretty vulgar at times, so for a game this over the top, it never felt out of place or too far. It's crazy to play this game and then realize Cummings also played Winnie the Pooh. And by the way, is anyone else really looking forward to this movie? No, I'm serious, I mean this unironically. It looks awesome. Other roles don't get as much voice time as Cummings, but they still deliver excellent performances. Josh Keaton provides a fantastic Rick Taylor, who throughout plays a rainbow of emotions.
No! Jenny!
I genuinely believe that he cares deeply for Jennifer, and at times is both enjoying and is uneasy with his newfound strength.
Feels good, doesn't it?
And speaking of his incredible strength, I've always said the goal of any action game is to make you, the player, feel like a badass. And goddamn, is Rick a badass.
Now, I'm a fan of Splatterhouse, and yes, this game is super fucking gory. But I will not be so easily swayed. If I want tons of gore, I'll just watch Dead Alive or Riki-Oh for the millionth time. It's gonna take more than gallons of the red stuff to please me, and Splatterhouse could have taken a more pandering route, like a lot of hyper-violent games take. But the action, weapons, puzzles, set pieces push Splatterhouse to that almost perfect marriage of style and substance. Almost. The fighting system is great with many brutally satisfying moves, but these claims that it's just a shallow button masher are completely untrue. I mean, sure, early on in the game, you can just mash the A button and come out on top, but later on, if you run headfirst into a pack of 6, 7, 8, 9 enemies, just mindlessly mashing buttons, get ready to watch that fucking loading screen. Oh yeah, more on that later. The fighting system isn't as deep as God of War or strategically demanding as Ninja Gaiden, but when Rick hits hard, you fucking feel it. And it's because you're fighting 6, 7, 8, 9 enemies at a time, or a couple giant monstrosities, the action is above all satisfying. It's not the deepest fighting system, but it not only gets the job done, it exceeded my expectations. And I suppose the animations could have been tighter in certain parts, but that crap doesn't in any way affect the playing experience. It's still really fun.
An issue I hear a lot about are the splatter kills. When a creature is near death, they'll turn black and red. If you grab them, you'll initiate a short quick-time event, which, if you're successful, you'll get bonus blood points, which is this game's currency. And there are claims that this idea is poorly implemented because you often kill enemies before you have a chance to perform the splatter kills, which is totally true. For like the first 2 levels, when enemies are super weak. By the end of the game, you're praying for an enemy to turn red so you can score a quick kill and even things out. I wonder if some of you mainstream critics played this game past the first 2 hours. Now, it's true there isn't a whole lot of variety. Some of these animations get old and maybe go a bit too far, but there's a couple that are always pretty satisfying. My favorite is this one. Haha! Yeah, most games would have just ripped the head off, but Splatterhouse, we take the whole fucking torso. Awesome!
So the team at Namco did an excellent job making Rick a fun, savage beast, but Splatterhouse has always been about the weapons, and goddamn, they got him here for sure. Pipes, nail-ridden 2x4s, machetes, chainsaws, severed monster heads and arms, your own severed arm, and probably the most satisfying shotgun in any game ever. But just because you're wielding a weapon doesn't mean you're untouchable. Rick swings pretty hard, but it's easy to get smacked during your windup. Unless you're fighting these guys, but come on, they're like popcorn. But typically, if you get carried away and run into a crowd mashing the A button, even brandishing a weapon, get comfy for that loading screen. The set pieces are also pretty inventive. In many parts of the game, you're tasked to complete a small puzzle to continue, and you often must impale a certain number of enemies on spikes or feed a giant hungry mouth. Yep, that's definitely one of the weirdest things I've ever seen in a game. Sometimes the spikes are up in the air and you gotta slam enemies with a 2x4 or a pipe to get them up there. Not only are these parts hyper-violent and gory, they're a good example of style and substance because they're pretty creative. Oh yeah, and children probably shouldn't be watching this review. If your kid's watching this, you're a terrible parent.
And this is a good time to point out that Splatterhouse is crazy violent and gory, not meant for kids. But just like with all the previous entries of the series, you never attack humans or people. It's always otherworldly demons and zombies. And it's not like Rick is a bad person. He's a good person, caught in a bad situation, just trying to save his girl. At one point, the mask says to Rick, "You promised you'd love her until the end of the world." Well, the end of the world is coming. Time to prove you're a man of your word. And when you think about it, that's actually super romantic. And that's not something you can say about Grand Theft Auto, Manhunt, or really any game that parents, groups, and politicians get hot and bothered over. Mass Effect, of course, gets a pass here, but I digress. It's the reason I loved old Splatterhouse, and it's the reason I love new Splatterhouse. For how hyper-violent it is, it has a surprisingly strong moral center, and I applaud the team at Namco for recognizing this and embracing it with this new entry. But just because I'm the happy nerd and a huge Splatterhouse fan does not mean I'm not fair, and it wouldn't be fair if I didn't address some of Splatterhouse's problems.
This may surprise you, but I hated this game at first. Hated it. Did not like it. At first. And I'll tell you why. This game starts too quickly. Now when we're talking story, Splatterhouse moves very quickly, and I like that, but when it comes to gameplay, it really throws you in the deep end without much guidance. Your very first fight is when you're in Monster Rick mode, which is fun, but not something you do very often, so right away, you're introduced to something that isn't very important. Then it explains the controls as you push on forward, and it explains them very quickly, only once, and without a lot of detail. I found myself struggling to stay alive saying, wait, what did that say? How do I do that? The instruction book was no help here.
Damn it.
By the time the game told me how to roll and block, I was screaming, "No fucking shit, asshole! I already died 10 times and figured that out on my own!" One of the most important moves, the health regeneration move, can't even be performed until the game tells you about it, which makes those first few rooms kinda hard. By the way, you might want to write this down. Left trigger and B regenerates your health. There, I just saved it like a half hour. Geez, Ninja Gaiden wasn't even this hard on the first play. I ended up starting a new game and playing through on easy because it took me so long to figure out what the hell I was doing. I appreciate the producer is trying to integrate a tutorial into the actual first level to help progression, but this mishandled attempt hurt the game by giving it a super rough start. I mean, it literally tells you how to grab enemies on the 3rd level. Once you figured it all out, it's a lot of fun. For example, I really enjoy the battle arenas, but geez, this game could use an actual tutorial or a training level. And this is a continued problem throughout the game, it just doesn't explain new mechanics very well. The biggest issue is the platforming segments. There are a dozen or so instances where all of a sudden you have to jump and grab at something, and the game does a very poor job informing you of not only where to jump to, but that you need to jump in the first place. The game expects you to notice that a certain part of the scenery has started flashing a faint white, and that you need to jump to it. And if you miss it, guess what? You die. And now you have to wait for the game to load. And oh my god, does this game have one of the longest and most annoying loading screens I've ever seen. Man, I haven't seen loading this long since the PS1 days. The first Resident Evil doesn't even take this long to load. These platforming segments suck because they are poorly explained, poorly executed, and punish you with long loading times. But once you figure them out, they're no problem. But even on my third time through, I still had trouble with some of these segments. And speaking of the platforming segments, there are these really cool 2D segments that are a great throwback to the classic series. These are a lot of fun. They're also a good break from the action and help the flow. But the jumping can be really tricky. Just because things go 2D doesn't mean the physics change, and if you don't get a running start and jump just right, guess what? Loading screen! I really wanted to like these segments more than I did, but god, it is so easy to fall and die. And I grew up on 2D. If I'm having trouble with these parts, I can't be the only one. The bosses and environments are a mixed bag, but are low on my list of gripes. The first boss, who I guess is supposed to be a throwback to the Poltergeist boss from the original, is passable but feels completely trite. But then the fight with Biggie Man was fucking incredible. That's fan service done right. Also, the giant gorilla, I originally had my doubts reading about him in the previews, but damn, it's good to be wrong sometimes. I loved the amusement park level. Man, why wasn't there a first-person view? I captured so much footage of this level because there were so many cool things to photograph. The meat factory was also fantastic, but the apartment complex was nothing spectacular. And the first level of the mansion was also underwhelming. Again, this game just has a sloppy start. But that's really the take-home message here. Splatterhouse has a rough start. But once things start taking off and you start buying new moves, exploring the cooler levels, you'll discover a solid action game. It's not perfect, and I will admit I certainly enjoyed Splatterhouse more the second time through, but to be honest, I felt the exact same way about Resident Evil 4. And Resident Evil 4 was probably the best game of the decade, but it took me until New Game Plus before I realized that.
Alright, Happy Nerd, what the fuck do you know? You're just a fanboy. How can we trust you? Right, just a fanboy? Have you seen my Mega Man 10 review? No, I'm easy on Splatterhouse for more reasons than just I'm a fan. First off, I've beaten this game. Twice. I have serious doubts the critics have even played half. Second of all, these claims of enormous frame rate drop and terrible camera are simply not true. Maybe the critics played a really late beta instead of the finished version. Another is, and I don't mean to be rude, but I actually had pretty low expectations for Splatterhouse. But that's because I followed it since it was first announced in the summer of 2008.
It doesn't take a genius to see that this game definitely had a rocky development. Splatterhouse was first greenlit in early 2007 and was released in late 2010, which makes Splatterhouse's total development just shy of 4 years. Now that's not extremely long, but a lot of the development was marred by switching teams. In the summer of 2009, a few months shy of its then scheduled release, Namco was not satisfied with how things were going and pulled Splatterhouse from Team Bottle Rocket and developed the rest of the game in-house. And if you compare the trailers that came out around that time with the finished product, there was a lot of work done. But stuff like the fighting system, the story, dialogue, and voice work, and of course the inclusion of the original 3 games are all excellent. The in-house producers clearly did not have time to polish everything, which explains the long load times, sound glitches, and other shit that mainstream critics care about, but actual gamers don't or shouldn't. The game does have problems, but most of them didn't bother me. The platforming parts and the loading times were the worst things if you ask me, and that hardly makes this game terrible.
Such a shame this game was completely shat on by the critics. It's probably one of the reasons why there was a big shakedown at Namco, and most of the Splatterhouse team was let go. It's probably also the reason why we will never see another Splatterhouse again. I know that's a really depressing note to end the video on, but I make a point of saying this in the video because we all know what happened last time, so you know, sometimes it's good to be wrong, so stay positive. Besides, by the time most of you see this video, Splatterhouse will have dropped in price, and it's definitely worth whatever reduced price you could find. And you know what else this means? I'm finally done with all these revamps and re-ups and all these new shit. I can get back to doing what I love to do, old school. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with the new school stuff, but you know, old school, that's just my thing. So this is the Happy Nerd saying, I'll see you soon, back at the old school. Cheers. Get out of here.